Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Before we start, I would like to go through the logistics with you as you are all familiar with the Zoom features. We have the Q&A box at the bottom. So during the presentation, you're welcome to ask questions, or if you have any technical issues you would like to let us know, please put it there. You can use the chat box as well. It's flexible, and Stephen, our speaker, will answer your questions after his presentation. And as you also are aware, at the top of the Zoom window, we are recording the webinar. After today's section, we will share the recording with all the registrants. So you're welcome to share with your colleagues, or if you miss some part of it, you can rewatch it. The last thing I want to remind is if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know in the section, and I'm sure Stephen will share his contact information as well. So you're welcome to contact him, or you can contact us and we can share your questions with him. So if you have no questions, I will pass over to Stephen, then he can start the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be presenting here today on the ASCII webinar on the 10th of August, 2022. My name is Dr. Stephen Morse. I'm the founder and CEO of Unchained Solutions. At Unchained, we inspire Australian organisations to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery through the implementation of the Modern Slavery Act. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country, recognising that people are joining us from many parts, even outside Australia. Today, I'm speaking from Gadigal country, upon which parts of the northern beaches of Sydney are based. So in the spirit of reconciliation, Unchained acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Well, it's a privilege to present to you today, and the focus of today is going to be on unchaining modern slavery. And Unchained Solutions, we specialise in this field, and my background is in this space with my own doctoral research in human trafficking intervention. Just going to share my screen so I can begin to share what we're going to be focusing on today. So yes, here we go. So today we're going to just give a brief bit of an introduction to Unchained Solutions, what we do, and we'll set the context for what we're going to discuss today. We'll look at the legislation side of things, so give an update on what's going on the anti-slavery front and some developments that are moving, so things that you should actually be aware of. And then I'm going to articulate some key priorities for supply chain professionals, including procurement and logistics, before just running you through some e-learning modules that we're working with that we are looking to promote through the ASCII membership portal. So you'll be able to access them very, very soon. What I won't do today is articulate what modern slavery is. I'm assuming that in joining today that you have some knowledge of what the issues are in terms of the scope and definitions. If you don't, I'm very more than happy to discuss it with you. You can also ask those questions in the chat if you would like some further clarifications around what modern slavery is. But I'm just going to make the general assumption that that is given for the audience today. So about Unchained Solutions. Well, we inspire Australian organisations to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery. We know that the issue of modern slavery is a complex piece and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy and resources, a long-term commitment to making an impact in this space. What we want about is to make sure that the conversation around modern slavery, as dark and as complex as it is something that is inspiring for Australian leaders, that actually leads to a culture change within organisations. We want to see organisations as leaders, as well as business leaders functioning as leaders, to make an impact and to see within their own ecosystems where they can actually make that impact in the space, recognising that not all reporting entities are going to be able to have a direct impact on people who actually are affected by modern slavery. We are a survivor-oriented organisation, and that's our background. And so, whilst we do care about our clients, our main sort of end user, if you like, are those who are being impacted, whether or not they're in factories, farms, or in fisheries, way through the supply chain at various touch points. And so, our engagement with corporate Australia, for example, is with a view to serving those who are badly affected. We do want to see the Modern Slavery Act implemented in any boardroom. We do see it as an excellent vehicle, if you like, a framework for companies to employ, and also then to use, if you like, transferred skills to then address other human rights issues and violations. We just see it as a really good vehicle for businesses to make a positive social impact, particularly as organizations from year on, year out actually apply themselves. It will lead to a culture change within an organization. Our commitment, we are based in Sydney, and so we know that we are removed from the coalface, the grassroots of risk. And so our commitment to the space is to give a portion of our profits to ending modern slavery. Our chief partner is the Freedom Business Alliance. That's a global organization with more than 100 social enterprises that are providing vocational training and meaningful employment to people that have been, that are coming out of some sort of enslaved scenario environment, or those who may be at risk for all sorts of reasons, given the context in which they're living. And so that's our commitment to the space, is through this organization. In terms of our value, Unchained has a unique lived experience in humanitarian work with survivors of modern slavery. And so members of our team who actually have touch points have either worked in the space. So we're not coming to this space from a theoretical point of view, but really from a lived experience. Our focus is really around procurement and supply chain management. That's our expertise in terms of our analysis. And so we've combined that lived experience with knowledge and tools to help organizations to assess the risks, develop strategies, develop their policies, train their employees, and really accelerate their engagement with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 5, 8, 12, and 17. That's where we fit in the picture of the SDGs. Our solutions really cover 5 areas of service. We have training products, analytical tools and processes, strategies, reporting, and research. So we can engage your board with an executive briefing. We can also engage your entire team at an awareness level, but also at a skills-based level, and also engage your suppliers. Our analytical tools cover the governance framework, as well as looking at the entire value chain from the direct to indirect suppliers, and through our channel partners there. We can also do the deep dive analysis to actually get to clarify and verify those risks throughout the supply chain, and not just rely on a theoretical understanding of risk. We combine all that with a lot of strategic work, working to help organizations to reframe their whole entire approach, or even to get it set up with that approach. We look at their policies. We look at how they're measuring effectiveness, which is criteria 5 of the Modern Slavery Act, which is one of the weakest areas of compliance. And we do a lot of work to help organizations to be effective in their supplier engagement. We do a lot of work also around reporting, so reviewing statements, developing statements and policies, and helping them and developing those statements and policies. And we also have a research partner in Macquarie University, where we're actually conducting the corporate engagement, and to better understand how organizations are adhering to the legislation, and what steps they're taking, and where the gaps might be, to better inform the entire market on this issue. So if you need assistance with this issue, I'm not going to give a big plug today, but please be in touch. We'd love to discuss your needs with you. Some of the areas that we work in, we have a broad sweep of work that we're a part of. We are largely industry agnostic, but we've had the privilege of working with a number of great companies in a number of key sectors. Most of our work presently is in construction, and we're working with a number of stakeholders in that sector. We've also done a lot of work with health, and especially in producing e-learning modules for the health sector. But we have clients in mining, education, agriculture, finance, logistics, and not-for-profits and retail space as well. And so we're just part of our, the joy of what we do is actually just working and learning different sectors and seeing how they intersect. Because, for example, we know that finance and construction have intersection with lots of different other sectors as well. So it's a great work. We're enjoying the work that we're doing in the space. Our research partner, our impact partner is the Freedom Business Alliance, and you might like to have a look further in ways in which you can actually make an impact through them. One of the things we do in terms of helping our organizations to go further is really to then form shared value partnerships with those who are working at the grassroots, and that could be through NGOs or social enterprises. And so we're as a business, we want to partner primarily with other social enterprises that are working in this space who are working directly with survivors of modern slavery risk. We also work collaboratively, I can't say that word today, sorry. We have a number of partners, and we do encourage a collaborative approach, and so we demonstrate that through the partnerships that we have. And so we just know that addressing modern slavery is not going to occur in isolation with a siloed approach. So we want to see partnerships formed within different sectors, companies working together, as well as organizations working with government, with NGOs and other groups to make an impact, because there's no one size or one fit solution to address modern slavery risk. So then moving on to where I think things are at in terms of anti-slavery legislation, just to give you an update on some of the movements and things that are happening to better inform your own engagement with this issue. There are a number of pieces of legislation emerging worldwide. Some have been in place now for a few years, the oldest being the Californian Transparency and Supply Chain Act, which has been around since 2010, and the UK Act, which has been around since 2015. In terms of what's going on with the modern slavery legislation in Australia, at the Commonwealth level, there's currently a statutory review which commenced late March this year, and what's the status of that at the moment is that the review is to be conducted over 12 months to be completed next year. And will commence with a consultation paper, which was due out mid-year. We're still awaiting that paper to actually comment, and a number of entities will have the privilege of being able to speak into that and to make their own comments and recommendations for the consultation process, which will then go towards the bill going back into Parliament in 2023. Some of the recommendations that are being made are around lowering the threshold for reporting, providing much more resources in terms of the government providing understanding of what key areas of risk are, key industries, key products, countries, for example, looking at ways in which we can incentivize the market more, and obviously reviewing the whole idea of how do we enforce compliance on this issue. So there's a range of different ideas going forward, even having a commissioner for the legislation. So that's currently happening at a Commonwealth level. At a state level for New South Wales, we've recently had the appointment of a commissioner and to actually steer the legislation. In terms of what organisations need to do, there's nothing there for the private sector in terms of needing to comply with the legislation. However, there is a focus on New South Wales government entities, so state procurement and local government areas, to actually comply with the Modern Slavery Act at a Commonwealth level, and to do the due diligence similar to a reporting entity. So what this means is similar to the Commonwealth legislation and the state legislation, is that if you are doing business with government at the state or even local government level, at the federal level, then you'll need to actually comply with the legislation, even though you may not be a reporting entity. So that's something to consider. And in terms of where we're at in the space, we also know that there is a knock-on effect in the market that SMEs, micro businesses, those who are falling under the threshold for compliance at 100 million needing to comply, and there's a big, in a sense, a knock-on effect going on in the market, which is ideal. It's kind of what I think was hoped, that as the big end of town was directly targeted, there would be a flow-on effect into other aspects of the market and smaller entities. There has also been some movement around amending the Customs Act, which went through the Senate late last year to ban goods produced by forced labour. And so to make sure that, no product entering Australia is made by people who are being impacted by modern slavery. This legislation has not got through the lower house at this point, and it's not clear what's going to happen, but it hasn't actually got through, and then we've had a federal election. So, but what is interesting here is that there is an emergence of legislation in Australia and a movement to actually ban the importation of forced labour goods. This ties in well with the Modern Slavery Act in itself, is that as companies do the due diligence and actually understand the risks, then they'll be in a better position to identify, well, this and that product is made by forced labour. But you can't really, the challenge of the Customs Act amendment, if you hadn't done the due diligence, then you would have issues with the Customs Amendment. Globally, in other parts of the world, there's been a recent shift and change in the Customs Act in the United States, with the banning of products made by forced labour in the Xinjiang province in China, specifically. So that's currently in place. And in terms of other Commonwealth entities, New Zealand is currently in a consultation process with anti-slavery legislation and work exploitation. And Canada, which has been working on legislation for a few years now, has come up with an amended bill to go through their parliament to bring in anti-slavery legislation. There's also been long-standing now legislation in France and Netherlands, and the European Union is also introducing legislation around due diligence in modern slavery risk. So we can see that there are movements globally. There is a shift and a development from soft law, if you like, which say the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the guiding principles on business and human rights is the kind of soft UN protocols and guiding principles are now being translated into hard legislation in different countries. And so we're seeing, thankfully, a movement towards more responsible business practices in terms of the production of goods and services. And so this is something you need to be mindful of and be aware of. In terms of then the response that we're seeing in Australia and what we're perceiving, there's been a number of reports and bits of research being done over the last 12 months or more. Some of them are highlighted here. One by the International Justice Mission. Monash University put out a report on the top 100 ASX listed companies. The Human Rights Law Centre also looked at 4 high-risk sectors, 102 statements. And at Unchained, in our partnership with Macquarie University, we've actually researched 135 statements over the course of 2021-22. What's interesting about all this research that's been done, looking at the statements that have been produced and registered on the Modern Slavery Register, is some common themes that have really come out. And I leave you to look at these reports yourself, but probably 4 things really stand out in terms of the engagement. One would be a lack of supplier risk assessment beyond direct suppliers. I think that's been a big challenge for a lot of organizations who perhaps have very sophisticated risk management systems in place to identify, categorize and identify risk in those suppliers that they have that are most visible, those being, for example, in the same jurisdiction such as Australia. But the challenge then of actually going beyond direct suppliers and taking an approach that is actually beyond sort of an algorithm or a theoretical approach. So there are data sets out there, and those data sets are reliable to the extent in which they give you a general understanding of the risks. But what's needed here really is to get to the specifics, and I'll go into that a little bit later. And that's one of the challenges. The second challenge would be a lack of stakeholder engagement for capacity building. And so we've seen a lot of organizations having done a risk assessment, then issue an SAQ, but those SAQs just being issued out and without much stakeholder engagement to understand the actual needs of suppliers and how they can best work with their client, their customer, to work in partnership together. There's also a weakness there also too in really understanding people at risk who may be servicing a facility or working, say, within a context like Australia, say in agriculture, to actually understand the needs of people working in those contexts. And so there's a greater need for both engaging with those stakeholders and building the capacity of suppliers and farmers, for example, whoever it is, to those entities that are governing the work that's being done or have commissioned that work to actually understand and build the capacity to have the skills to actually do the work. There's a lack of a clear remediation strategy for organizations to think through what does remedy look like, and what are the implications of that from both a financial and legal perspective, but also part of sort of stems from the stakeholder engagement piece, not really doing enough at the stakeholder engagement level to actually see perhaps some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the easy wins that could be simply done, implemented around remedy to make the situation, the context in which people are working, much more palatable, much more enjoyable and meaningful and helpful for them. And finally, then, a lack of clear metrics to measure effectiveness. So as I mentioned earlier, criteria 5 of the Modern Slavery Act talks about having a framework, being able to describe how you're measuring effectiveness. You don't at this point have to show what those metrics are, but to actually have a clear strategy and a clear idea of how to measure effectiveness on the work that you're doing. So a lot in that, what that says is that there's a lot of processes out there that people are adopting. Some of them are effective, some of them are not. There are limitations, and people aren't really then thinking through, well, how do we actually measure how effective this process is? So that would be the state of play in terms of the legislation and the corporate response. I'm just going to go through this. So what are some priorities then for supply chain professionals? Well, here is a breakdown of the criteria of the Modern Slavery Act. And we know that most of the work that needs to be done here in terms of due diligence is really around 3, 4, and 5. So to describe the practices, to really discover what's going on, and to do that investigation process. And so there's different degrees in which that can be done. Most in terms of what the work that's being done here, a lot of it is still high level and general in nature, and there's a need to go into the specifics. There is then, in terms of then, once we've found things or identified things, what is our response? And so 1, 3, if you like, will then feed into 4. If we're not doing enough to identify risks, then there's not a lot of actions that we can take. There are still actions we can take in terms of putting in place the right governance framework or risk management framework, to actually set up a system and a SaaS platform, for example, to manage the progress of suppliers, for example. All these things are responses, but they're all foundational of what needs to happen. And so there's a need to build on 3 and 4. And finally, then in the process of that, to attribute the right indicators, metrics, impact areas, outputs and outcomes to actually demonstrate how effective 3 and 4 are in terms of the work that organizations are doing. There's obviously a key role then here for supply chain professionals, particularly those in procurement who are sourcing, who are in a sense have an eye on supply chain and on what's going on. So there's a need here. There's an expectation, I suppose, that there's clarity already at hand in terms of what is actually going on, at least at the direct supplier level. So where are we up to? So key priorities, I think we're in the third year of reporting for many entities, and it's really surprising, but not terrible, but it is surprising to come across entities even today who are reporting entities, but who have actually not really done much to engage with the issue of modern slavery since it came into play back in 2019. So that is surprising, but that's okay. We work with everyone who comes to us and encourage them and congratulate them on the work that they're doing. But I really think by now you should have a very robust and understanding of your direct suppliers, particularly those in Australia, that those suppliers have been categorized, mapped, and a risk management system established. So what this means is that suppliers, the risk assessment in this sense is not simply just grabbing maps and data or information from the Global Slavery Index and the ILO, for example, and grabbing maps and putting them in a report. A supplier risk assessment is really about taking the procurement spend that you have and categorizing them along US SPSC codes or another coding system to actually understand what are the different categories and segmentation for these suppliers, and then to overlay that with a risk matrix of country risk and industry risk in particular to understand low, medium, high, where the risk of modern slavery is. This is a very foundational step that needs to occur, and in order to then be able to segment and prioritize what your supplier engagement piece is going to look like. The second stage, really by now too, having categorized and mapped and your suppliers and identified key areas of risk, is to then have a level of supplier engagement. A classic piece here has been the issuing of an SAQ, a self-assessment questionnaire. And there's been various levels of response to that and effectiveness with an SAQ. I've seen many SAQs systems. Perhaps you might have 100 suppliers and you'll get maybe a 30% success rate in terms of completion, or SAQs that are not completed properly. The answers are skewed or fudged or whatever the situation is. There are ways to do this, which I think are good practice. And one of them is to actually bring suppliers together in a forum for training to articulate the why and the how of the SAQ, and to provide some basic training and understanding of what modern slavery is and what the Modern Slavery Act is actually asking of you as a reporting entity and its relationship then to suppliers. That then opens the door then to actually articulate the questions and what the questions in the SAQ are about. And suppliers can then ask questions and verify how they can best answer those questions effectively. In that process too, you can then discuss the code of conduct for suppliers and see that as a collaborative effort to not as something which is necessarily just mandated, but something that suppliers can buy into. You can also articulate changes to contracts and the onboarding process for new suppliers. So there's a lot more that can be done in terms of stakeholder engagement and a collaborative approach to engaging with suppliers, and in the process, incentivizing them to actually go beyond and to assess their direct suppliers as well, and to work through the supply chain. And in our engagement with organizations, we have seen, we've had testimony from organizations who are the reporting entity, who are struggling to actually incentivize and encourage suppliers to actually do their own process. And so this comes back to the leadership piece of actually setting the stage, providing resources, building the capacity among your suppliers to actually do the process themselves. One of the other challenges here as well that we're seeing is when a supplier is a reporting entity, and so taking at face value, well, here is our policies, here's our position statement. There is, I think, a greater need here for not just taking things at face value, but for organizations who may be more peer-to-peer, although one is supplying to the other, to actually find pathways to collaborate and demonstrate how they can both work together to go down, to go deeper in their implementation. Also, I think by year 3 reporting, there should be policies should be reviewed and developed, and a process for socializing them both internally and externally. That should also be in place, particularly around the supplier code of conduct and the procurement policy. From there, I think organizations, it'd be good to, if they haven't already, start thinking through an ethical sourcing strategy. So where, for example, they might have a supplier that they actually can't actually go further with, there's no leverage with that supplier, to then actually have strategies to source elsewhere where there is more responsible business practices, and where perhaps they can have more leverage to work with that supplier to develop the capacity to not just address issues around quality and efficiency, but to identify perhaps where there's leakage in the supply chain, where there could be better business practices. And so in this sense, to actually not just see modern slavery assessments as a cost center, but as a potential profit center as well. From there, to actually then go deeper and do a deep dive assessment, what might be called a vertical mapping exercise. So from the initial risk assessment to identify key areas of high risk, key product lines, goods, for example, that you might need to actually think, well, instead of we've gone broad, but now let's go narrow and actually go down through the supply chain. We're currently working with a consortium of companies who are working together on key product lines that they all share and source equally in, to work together and collaborate to go further and deep down to identify risks and to get to the factory level, wherever that is in the world. And finally, to then to couple that is to then do an auditing process and to engage an external auditing firm to then do site visits, either scheduled or spot, to actually verify those risks and embed that within a comprehensive audit, not just to identify human rights violations, but to look at other considerations around workplace health and safety, quality assurance, environmental considerations, so that it's not as so confronting for those at the factory level, for example. So there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are what I see as some key priorities, and particularly for those who have been in the reporting cycle for some time now, to actually have a structure and have the investment to actually go deeper in the risk assessment work that they're doing. For those of you who perhaps are not quite sure how to best map out your implementation strategy, we can assist you with that. But here is another way of thinking about perhaps how over different stages of reporting, what you could be achieving at each for each different statement. So by statement 1, you've laid the foundations, you've got the government's framework set up and a gaps analysis and action plan. You've reviewed your policies, you've mapped out your direct suppliers, and you've done some initial winners training. From there into stage 2 then is to then start engaging with the suppliers, the code of conduct, and to actually then provide some skills training for key personnel who actually engage with suppliers. Then into year 3 then is to then go deeper in terms of vertical mapping, looking at more of the operational risk and third-party labor hire, and then looking at more around measuring effectiveness and the whole grievance mechanism and some of those more detailed policies and processes around remedy and grievance, into stage 4, where you might then consider having the auditing take place, doing a complete risk management framework review and a data strategy review, and perhaps even by then to redo your initial risk assessment, because no doubt in those 3 years there'll be shifts and changes in terms of who is in your supply chain in itself. So that's just a suggested roadmap that you might like to consider if you don't have one, and very, very happy to talk about that with you further. So in terms of then some of the other things that we need to consider and that I've just touched on, and is, how do we actually go deeper? One of the concerns that have come out in a book by Nolan and Bersma is that modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage, reduce, and eliminate modern slavery, we need to first acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges. We should treat the symptoms and the causes. And so as we think about going further in terms of our implementation of the Modern Slavery Act and our risk assessment work, is to actually get down to the context, the level of context. One of the limitations for many organizations that I've said earlier is this reliance on received data, which is reliable, there's nothing wrong with that data, but it needs to be seen as data which is general in nature and not specific to your organization and your supply chain. So the data sets that are available to you are will in one sense inform some of the decisions you need to make and help you to segment and to organize and to strategize. But the real work that I think Nolan and Bersma are getting to is to actually go beyond the processes, go beyond the foundational levels to actually get to the larger contextual problems, to, in a sense, to treat where the risk is actually occurring. Now, there's obviously been some challenges of that in terms of the limitations around travel. And so if most of your risk is in Southeast Asia and you haven't been able to travel because of COVID restrictions, obviously that's something that needs to be considered. But as the world opens up, there's more opportunity. Some see this, there's an issue around here, and there was an article produced through Monash University around the issue of psychological distancing, that many organizations just see that the problem is somewhere out there. This can actually then, in a sense, sort of the bias that can form to thinking, well, we don't have any risk because we actually haven't done much to investigate that risk. But there's, as I said earlier at the ASCI conference earlier this year, there is really a need to go beyond compliance to bridge that psychological distance to understand the context for workplace exploitation. And that requires, partnering, not just relying on data sets, but actually partnering with NGOs, with experts in the field to actually understand what is actually going on in a particular jurisdiction. What are some of the push and pull factors contributing to risk in this area? What are some of the local customs and laws and business practices that are impacting the workplace, this particular workplace? And so having a better understanding of the actual context in which the exploitation is occurring will help better inform your approach. So the more you understand the specifics of risk, the better your response will be to that, and you'll actually have more to measure in terms of the framework for measuring effectiveness. It's out of this context of workplace exploitation then that you will then get a deeper stakeholder-based approach to risk, to actually having an opportunity through perhaps an NGO to then understand and consult with people who are at risk or who have been impacted, and to use different tools, particularly digital tools that are out there, to actually get people's perspectives who are actually being impacted by slavery. So not just relying on general assumptions, but actually to bridge the gap and to raise the voice of those who are being impacted. So there's a great need for that to occur in order to go deeper. And from there, then you'll, in terms of that state level of stakeholder engagement, then we'll be able to have a much deeper stakeholder-based approach to remedy. So in terms of the priorities, yes, you make sure you have that right foundation in place. But as you go deeper, there will be a need to move from the general to the specific, and that will occur through a much greater stakeholder-based approach to risk and to remedy. Well, I'm just conscious of the time and to move on to questions. So that may have raised a whole range of questions for you, and I welcome you to put those questions in the chat. Or in the Q&A chat box as well. There's 2 options there. I really encourage you to put your questions in there. We just want to conclude today by talking about what we're doing at Unchained. Through our engagement with entities, we've come up with a number of workshops and teaching tools that we've been using virtually through Zoom and Teams and other online platforms, where we've also been in a process of translating that into e-learning modules to help organizations go deeper. And throughout, currently in negotiations with ASCII to provide and make those modules accessible for members at a reduced rate for ASCII members. We are currently producing, well, we're not producing 6 modules, we're currently producing 5 modules because one of them has already been produced. So we currently have on the market a high-level awareness module engaging with the issue of modern slavery, which you can access at the moment independently, independent of ASCII at the moment. And then that really will help your team to understand the main issues, the why and the what of modern slavery supply chains and what is required from the Modern Slavery Act, and also how you can also encourage your team to be responsible consumers as well. Module 2 will then focus on developing a framework for responsible sourcing and purchasing, so giving an overview of sustainable procurement, where ethical procurement fits within that, and some of the standards that need to take place. And then how to improve work-related practices through stakeholder engagement. And Module 3 will then focus more on the whole risk assessment process, strategies for categorizing your suppliers and assigning modern slavery risk indicators and overlaying that and segmenting that into low, medium, and high risks to then be able to prioritize your engagement with those suppliers. So we're putting that in a module. Note 4 is around how to develop policies to manage and monitor modern slavery risks. And so, as mentioned, so looking at things like, how to create an effective onboarding process, SAQs, a priority code of conduct, and different policies around procurement, remediation, and grievance. Module 5 is taking our measuring effectiveness strategy workshop and putting that on an e-learning module to give you an understanding of what does it mean to measure effectiveness and how to put in the right impact areas, indicators, metrics, and sort of to consider what inputs and what outcomes are going to be important. Part of this process is actually realizing the ecosystem in which your organization functions, because that will actually determine what kind of impact areas that you'll be able to focus on to address modern slavery risk. Finally, then we'll be exploring more around the idea of going beyond process based on the talk I gave at the ASCII conference, how organizations can think beyond and bridge that psychological distancing and actually have a much more deeper and robust stakeholder engagement to both identify risk and then provide the right remedy. So that's the 6 modules that we're currently developing, and our plan is to actually have them launched by mid-October this year. So more information to come. So at this point, it's 1:45, and I promised that I'd stop here at this point and open the door for people to ask questions. I think some of them are coming through the chat, so let me just stop sharing my screen at the moment. As I do that, you may like to, if you want to get in contact with me, there's a QR code that will take you to Linktree, and that will give you all my different socials and ways you can connect with me if you want to talk further about anything that I've said today. So just then, all right, let me just unshare my screen and then go to these questions. All right, one question. Let me just read the question. Yeah, so the question, is there a movement towards auditing suppliers in location rather than relying on distance self-reporting only? Certainly there is, and we recommend it. So there are entities out there who actually will be on the ground, have boots on the ground within 24 hours. Our partner, the organization we partner with is Kima, who are based in Hong Kong. So when we consider risk for Australian organizations in products, most of those products are coming from Southeast Asia. So Kima can actually have boots on the ground within 24 hours in 85 countries to actually do site audits, so those which are organized, and also do spot audits as well. So that is important. Auditing is important, although it can be seen as a snapshot in time. If you actually have an ongoing auditing framework strategy, then you can actually then track the development in what organizations are doing. So the question is, how do we avoid fraud when receiving these reports? So I gather the question is around how do we make sure that the information that people are presenting to us is accurate. It's obviously very difficult then to avoid fraudulent behavior and misreporting. So, and one of the challenges with the Modern Slavery Act is to make sure that companies are, it's a statutory requirement. It's a legal. It's a crime in a sense to provide misleading information. Although at the moment there's no fine for misleading information, so we're down to reputational risk. It's an expectation of the modern slavery piece that entities don't just take at face value or a report that's been given by an organization, but there's an opportunity there where possible to engage constructively and collaboratively with other entities that are reporting to get the answers and not just take what is given. So really, it's down to the onus is really on the reporting entity to do the due diligence and to find ways to work with suppliers who may be reluctant to provide information. There may be issues around privacy, around the sourcing of products and factories, for example. Really, the idea is to not do anything. Well, no solution is going to be, what I want to say, there's no solution that's going to be short-term in this regard. And so in a sense, part of the due diligence process is developing the right strategies, rapport, relationship, partnerships with suppliers, with other entities to do the risk and to verify risk and not to just sit with received data. It will only take a scandal, something to happen to then bring to light whether or not the due diligence has been done or not, been carried through or not. So yeah, this is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge for a lot of organizations at the moment, particularly smaller entities who are engaging with larger entities as suppliers who can't actually get beyond, well, this is our policy. So just read that and you'll have to be satisfied. I think the onus needs to be on those larger entities to actually show some leadership in demonstrating transparency, that the transparency is not just in here's our statement, but actually maybe inviting smaller entities into the conversation as well. Thanks for your presentation, Stephen. Just let me read the questions a bit long. Yes, so the question is just wondering if you could share your thoughts on the importance of genuine consultation with rights holders, stakeholders and workers, particularly with regard to both identifying modern slavery and remedy thereof. I think it's actually critical. I think it's definitely part of the way forward. We're currently in conversation with an organisation that's based in New Zealand, but coming into the Australian market, called Ask Your Team. They have their own tech platform, a self-assessment questionnaire, if you like, for workers, for people working, not just for suppliers, but to help understand what is actually going on at the grassroots, basically on the floor. So, for example, some of the work that they've been doing in New Zealand primarily has been in agriculture, and, for example, reaching out to some of the Pacific Islander groups of people that have come to New Zealand for the harvest, and using, and through the company who is managing that, who's open for that to happen, because they see the value in that, is to actually get each of those people who are working on the farm to log in, to create their own login. It's also the responses will be anonymous and aggregated, and to actually answer questions. And there are lots of aids there as well if people have limited literacy rates, or they may not be able to speak English very well, for example, because there are different languages that are used, and there's also accessibility for those who may have limitations in reading questions, and really to get clarity and in terms of the both understanding what the risks are, but also what are the solutions. We often think that, people who have, there's a problem in a space, but sometimes the best people who can answer that question, what's the problem here and what's the solution to this problem, are other people that are being impacted. So there is a growing number of companies in New Zealand at the moment who are benefiting and working collaboratively with Ask Your Team and those tools to actually track over time different working conditions for people that are working in, for example, in the agriculture space, especially. I suppose just on that, it may become a little bit more challenging to get that kind of stakeholder engagement in other parts of the world. We know, for example, it's virtually impossible at the moment to get any understanding of the risk with people who in Uyghurs, for example, in the Xinjiang province. It's virtually impossible to actually get a very clear understanding of what's going on and to do an auditing process, even just do an audit process, let alone a stakeholder engagement piece. But with the rise of technology and its ability to cross international borders, for example, there's a lot more opportunity to connect with people who are working in different contexts to actually get their perspective. So I keep on thinking of things to respond to that question. I suppose one of the other things around remedy is that often it's the people that are being affected, working in a facility. They actually know what the needs are in terms of remedy. So we can often be sort of put off or scared by this concept of remedy that's going to be this massive legal cost to us. Actually, remedy really can be there can be a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to remedy. And through people that we know who are within a manufacturing background, sometimes remedies can be simply as just making the workplace safe. Could be that, and safe and clean and efficient, that people have the right PPE, people have the right tools. Perhaps if there's a cafeteria in that environment, that there's good sanitation around the service and delivery and maintenance of food, that there's good air quality, for example, that there are amenities for both men and women and people of other gender, for example. So all these things can go into a remedy for an organization, and they can all be low-hanging fruit. Okay, well, yep. Does anyone have any other questions? Just give it another minute. They're great questions.
I think these are the questions, and thank you so much, Stephen, for your great presentation and also all the insights. And for all the attendees today, if you have any other questions, you got the contact information of Stephen. You can contact him, or you can send email to us, and we can share your email with him as well. As mentioned by Stephen, we are working with him on Unchaining Solutions to develop the e-learning courses, and once that is available, we will share the information with you all, and we hope we can all improve the situation. So thanks again, and just a reminder, today's webinar is recorded. The recording will be shared with all registrants. Thank you again for joining today, and thanks, Stephen, for the great presentation. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Have a great day.